Good morning. I'm Rob Morton, the minister at Tucker Christian Church, and this is our online sermon for March the 29th. Over the next couple of weeks, we're going to be placing our sermons and worship services online in order to respect the social distancing guidelines that have been given to us by our leadership. We want to comply with all of the guidelines that they're giving us so that this virus can be contained and eliminated. Our country has suffered tremendously, and we do not want to spread this any farther. So everything that we're doing over the next couple of weeks will be online. We hope that you join us and hope that you receive spiritual understanding and wisdom from the things that we're putting out here over the next few weeks. I want to talk to you this morning about a young man who was facing incredible odds. It's a story that's familiar to you, but is particularly relevant for these times. Excuse me. We still have some symptoms of the coronavirus here at our house left over, and doing much better, but are still battling a few little coughs and some of the leftover remnants of it, so I apologize for that. The young man I want to talk to you about was the youngest of several brothers, and during the time that this story took place, God's people were being threatened by a superior army. This young man was told to stay at home while his older brothers went off to defend their nation. His father told him that he wasn't quite old enough to go off to war, and that he wanted him to stay at home and watch over the sheep and the cattle and tend to things around the house. Wasn't a very popular decision with this young man who wanted to go with his brothers, but that was the lot of the youngest brother during that time. So that's what he did. It wasn't a very glamorous job, but that was his responsibility. One day, though, the boy's father told him that he was concerned about his older brothers, and he wanted him to go check on them. So the young man gathered up supplies, gathered up food, gathered up some other things that they needed, loaded them on his camels, and set off for the front lines. Once he got there, he got a less than favorable reaction from his older brothers. They thought that he had just slipped away and come to see the excitement of the battle, and were not very happy that he was there. He asked how the battle was going, and his brothers just told him to go back home and watch the sheep. His response is typical of a little brother. If you have a little brother, or you are a little brother, this young man's response will probably strike a chord with you. He said, "What have I done now? I just asked a question." That particular verse makes me laugh every time I read it, because I can hear the frustration in his voice. Being a younger brother myself, I can kind of hear that frustration he had at being the youngest one and not being able to do everything that the older ones always got to do. But soon after this confrontation took place, though, a scene played out on the battlefield that had been happening every day. One of the enemy soldiers, a giant of a man, came out to taunt the army. He challenged anyone to come out and face him in single combat. And he was so big, such an imposing enemy soldier, that none of the soldiers of God's army would dare to enter the battlefield with him. This young man, though, had a different response. He saw this giant taunting God's army, and he had this to say. He said, "Who is this pagan Philistine anyway, that he is allowed to defy the armies of the living God?" You can hear the faith in that young man's question. He was offended that anyone would dare to challenge the power of God. Now, if you haven't guessed it yet, this young man's name was David, and the enemy soldier's name was Goliath. This is one of the more famous stories from the Old Testament, one of my favorite stories. Over the next couple of weeks, we're going to be doing famous stories from the Old Testament as our sermon series, and I'm kind of excited about it. All those old stories that are very familiar to us and comforting to us, but that offer us peace and strength during these times. David hated the thought that this giant would be so brazenly arrogant in defying God. He hated the idea that this giant would call into question the power of God. And he might have been a little embarrassed that none of his fellow countrymen had taken up the challenge that this giant was making so arrogantly every morning on the battlefield. David relied on the power of God throughout his entire life. He was absolutely convinced that God was on his side, and he knew that God had the power to lead him through whatever situation he faced. This was an incredible challenge, but David was confident in the face of it. Goliath was a battle-hardened soldier equipped with the best weapons of the day. He far outclassed David in training and in ability and in technological advancement. None of these things fazed David, though. He trusted in a power that was higher than himself. And that's one of the things I want you to remember this morning. He trusted in a power that was greater than himself. David accepted this challenge. He accepted this challenge from this incredibly arrogant giant of a man. King Saul called David into his presence. King Saul was the first king of Israel and was leading the army at the time. And he very reluctantly allowed David to accept Goliath's challenge. He even offered to give David his own personal armor, but David said, "No, I'm not used to it, and that's just going to hinder me." So he went out to face Goliath with the only two weapons he had, his shepherd's staff and his slingshot. David was used to these weapons. As he was protecting his father's sheep, he would have had to use them from time to time. Protecting the sheep meant driving off predators that would seek to prey on the sheep. So he would have been used to using that slingshot to ward off wolves and maybe a bear and maybe a mountain lion or two. And his shepherd's staff, he knew how to use that as well. These were weapons he was accustomed to, but nothing like Goliath had. Nothing like Goliath had. As David made his way onto the battlefield, Goliath laughed when he saw David coming out. He laughed at this young, upstart little kid coming out to face him on the field of battle. He thought it was a joke. He said, "Were you going to send a dog out here to fight with me?" But David's response in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 45 through 47 is classic. 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 45 through 47. David says this, "And David replied to the Philistine, 'You come at me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. Today the Lord will conquer you, and I will kill you and cut off your head. And then I will give the dead bodies of your men to the birds and wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. And everyone assembled here will know that the Lord rescues his people, but not with a sword and spear. This is the Lord's battle, and he will give you to us.'" David's words here are strong. They're violent. But understand that this was a violent time and that David was a soldier. And he was facing a soldier, an enemy soldier, who was used to violence and intimidation. That was the language he knew, and so David spoke that language in return. And he was convinced that the power of God was going to give him that victory that day. These words that David spoke enraged Goliath. As soon as he was finished, Goliath started moving toward him. Now can you imagine this giant of a soldier dressed out in the most advanced armor of the day with a gigantic spear and a sword bearing down on you? It must have been like standing in front of a tank coming at you at full speed. It would have been intimidating. It would have been enough to make anyone turn and run, but David didn't. David didn't. He wasn't intimidated by this. David took a small stone, probably about this big, that he had picked up from a creek bed, a smooth stone that was aerodynamic, that would fly straight and true. Put it in his slingshot and he started twirling it over his head. When he got that stone up to speed and at just the right time, he let that stone fly. His aim was true and it hit Goliath right square in the forehead, and Goliath fell. Everyone was astonished. This little kid, this teenager, had felled the greatest of the Philistine soldiers. What a turn of events. David walked over to Goliath. He picked up Goliath's own sword, which was probably about as big as he was, raised it up and decapitated Goliath. When they saw their champion defeated, the Philistine army fled. Well, who wouldn't? This teenager had felled their greatest warrior. If someone so small could do this, what could their grown warriors do to them? So they ran. Israel's army pursued, defeating the Philistines all the way from the battlefield to their capital cities of Gath and Ekron. And the defeat was so great that the Philistines weren't able to mount another invasion of Israel for quite some time after this. It was an incredible victory for God's people, and it was all because a young man trusted in the power of God. We can trust in the power of God as well, and that's what I want you to understand today. That same power that David trusted to defeat Goliath is at work in us today. What's your Goliath today? We all have Goliaths that we face in life. What's yours right now? What are you facing in life that just seems like it's insurmountable? Maybe you're facing a situation in which you feel like you're looking at a raging enemy who's bearing down at you like a juggernaut. That's what a lot of people feel about this coronavirus, the COVID-19 outbreak. Those who don't even have the virus are being affected by it because so many people are having to lay off their workers because of social distancing and the fact that we all have to stay in place, shelter in place orders. The unemployment rate went up significantly last week because employers can't afford to pay their workers. So many jobs are ending right now. It's a frustrating, frightening, scary time. And those who have the virus, are suffering. We've had it at our house. It's like the flu times 10, and it just kind of lingers and lingers and lingers. And there are many who succumb to it. Those who are older, those who have underlying health problems, heart problems, breathing problems, diabetes. Many of those who have succumbed to it. It's frustrating, and it's frightening, and it's maddening. But just like David, though, we can trust in God. We know that God sees everything that happens. He knows our situation. He understands our struggles, and He understands our feelings. God is a present help during these times of trouble. But I want you to notice something about David, though. David trusted in God, but he acted on that trust. He didn't just sit back and do nothing, waiting to be rescued. He used the talents and resources God gave him to solve the problem, and he trusted in God's wisdom and power to strengthen and guide him. Sometimes we allow ourselves to be victims of our circumstances when we could be using what God has given us to overcome or manage the difficulties that we face. God has given you talents and abilities and wisdom that you might just underestimate. He wants you to prosper, and He's given you the tools with which to do so. Now, when I say He wants you to prosper, I'm not talking about material things here. He doesn't want to make you rich. Those kind of things really matter very little to God. He wants us to be happy. He wants us to have peace, and He wants us to have joy, and He knows that those things aren't brought about by material success. He wants you to have a sense of His love in your life and His presence in your life. And He wants to give you the strength to be able to face the challenges and the issues that have come your way. How do we access this power? How do we access this power? Through prayer, through meditation, through reading, through music, through the wisdom of godly brothers and sisters giving us counsel, by the Holy Spirit speaking to us, through the confidence that you have in yourself and the abilities that God has given you. Believe that God is going to lead you where you need to go and act on that. And do something to help. If you want to regain some control, if you want to regain a sense of peace and joy, do something during this time. The church needs to be active during these times. Now, I know that we have to stay inside. I know that we have to social distance. And some of you like us are under quarantine and you can't go anywhere. But we can still be active. We can still be active. Networks needs food and donations. Pick something up at the store, order it for delivery and have it sent to Networks, or have it brought to your house and then take it over there and give it to them. They need volunteers to help pass out bags. They're doing it with no contact. It's a drive-up. It's a drive-up process now. People drive up and the bags of food are handed to them. They need people who can help bag foods and give those out. The Atlanta Food Bank is asking for monetary donations. The Atlanta Food Bank can take $1 and make 4 meals out of that. 4 meals out of $1. That's tremendous. Donate to them. Give them that opportunity to feed those who are suffering because they've lost their jobs or who are having problems. Go check on a neighbor. Call somebody who you know is sick. Go shopping for somebody who's under quarantine. Find somebody some toilet paper. We were able to find toilet paper this week. It was a blessing. Walmart finally got wise and said that they're limiting people now to only 1 package of toilet paper per person. So that was a good thing. God is going to see us through this crisis. He's been faithful in the past, and He's going to be faithful now. Just as God helped David face Goliath, so God is going to help us face this virus. Let's take encouragement from the love that God has exhibited in the past to His people. If you're facing a Goliath today, know that God has given you the resources to overcome it. I hope that you're doing well. I hope that you are feeling well and are safe. Keep that social distancing space. Let's defeat this virus by following the guidelines that our leadership has given us so that we can get back to normal, so that we can get back to being in public with each other and fellowshipping with each other. And understand that God loves you, cares about you, and is with you every day. I hope that you have a good week. I hope you have had a blessed morning and that this worship has been meaningful to you. God bless each one of you.